Caesar's Messiah 2023 on Magic Jesus. This is the fourth installment in the series. Let me welcome Joseph Atwill.
Pleasure to be here, Philip. Thank you for having me.
All right, I understand you just got back from Europe. Where did you go when you were there?
I went to Barcelona and then to the French Riviera, basically just a chateau that a group had rented in near Montpellier.
Well, that sounds fantastic. Is that Andalusia, Spain?
No, it's Catalonia.
Okay, fascinating. It's a beautiful country, though.
Yeah, absolutely. We drove from Barcelona, and we've my wife and I have traveled in this area quite a bit, so we're familiar, and we had lots of friends that were there for this celebration that was occurring, and so it was a lot of fun. But always good to be back, I guess, and it takes a few days to get over the jet lag. We were there for almost 3 weeks.
Ah, I see. We are going to go ahead and talk about Decius Mundus today.
Sure.
And I'm thinking perhaps you want to start with explaining who Decius Mus was.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of a complex way to get into the analysis I did of the kind of puzzle that Josephus had created. But just for clarification for listeners, I maintain that the character that Josephus uses as sort of the centerpiece of this puzzle he created, I think his name is actually a pun, Decius Mundus, which would mean Decius world, mundus meaning world, I think is actually kind of associated with Decius Mus, who was a Roman patrician general who sacrificed himself. And I think that Josephus is making a kind of an overall comment on sacrifice for religious purposes. Decius Mus, he did what was called a devotio, which was a Roman particular kind of sacrifice where someone would sacrifice himself basically to the gods of the enemy, and in that way appease them so that they wouldn't assist the group that Rome was fighting. I mean, this is pretty esoteric religious activity, but Decius Mus was a very famous character in Roman theology, and I think he's making a Josephus, who created this character Decius Mundus, I think is the author of the story of Decius Mundus, is definitely making a kind of a pun on the original sacrifice, human sacrifice for religious purposes, because I maintain that the three tales, which are adjacent to one another in Josephus's text, are actually a kind of typological puzzle, and they are certainly, these three tales are obviously associated. For one thing, they are inserted into the text in Josephus at the exact point where the crucifixion of Jesus occurred as it was purported historically. Now, in one of the stories case, this is self-evident because it is the story of the so-called famous testimonium, which is Josephus's description of Jesus Christ. Just a short little description of Jesus and, broad outline of his life and his followers. And of course, there's just been enormous amounts of scrutiny given to this passage and criticism, and people claim it's real. People claim it was inserted after the fact by a Christian apologist.
You can't really prove the date that this came about.
No. I mean, for one thing, the way that the testimonium has been analyzed, I think, is illogical, because it's always analyzed in isolation, because it was such an important component of Christianity, to, the idea that there was historical documentation of Jesus was very important. So it was actually a religious denoted passage in early Christianity. They really thought this was very, very important. So from that perspective, it's understandable people would just look at it in isolation. But the fact is that it is only one of three stories that are all inserted at the exact point in time where you should have had Josephus's historical description of the crucifixion. So these three stories should at least be considered, particularly since they were all inserted at this exact point in the narration where Jesus would have been, it would have been recorded as having been crucified. They should, be looked at as to the relationship that they have to one another. And this has really never been done, which is, I would just say, an oversight on the part of scholarship, because when you look at the three, the first thing that you can see is that the three stories have parallels, very unusual ones. The second two stories, which are the Decius Mundus story and the story of Fluvalia, this Jewish woman who is seduced by a Jewish priest, are very, very similar. And in fact, some scholars who are alert have actually noticed that these stories are obviously related to one another, that the second and third story are in fact somehow related, though no one has really come up with an explanation as to why they're related or what it means, but that the stories that they tell are simply too parallel to not be somehow having been created, that and juxtaposed to one another. So I'll just read some of the parallels that I have written in my book concerning these last two stories.
Okay, can I back us up for
Of
just a
course,
minute?
yeah, I'm sorry if I'm not doing this.
No problem.
Yeah.
But you're saying that the name is a pun. So now I've noticed Roman names. Romans are often named for numbers, and Decius is no exception. It means of the number 10 or something like that. The 10 or the 10th. So Decius mus or moose, that's mouse.
Yeah.
And what do you make of that?
I don't know. It gets sort of you can speculate almost endlessly. They've
Well, you have Paulina in this, don't you?
Yeah, Paulina is a character in the central story, and when you get to solving the puzzle that the three stories create, you use basically name switching. You just switch the names of the characters that are shown to have parallels, and you create a story which is not on the written page, but in fact is just constructed logically, and it's very easy to do. And they give instructions that the reader should attempt to do this. One of the characters in the stories says, do not value the business of names. And okay, so Decius Mus is what I would say is just kind of part of the thought world that produces this story. It kind of brings it back into Roman humor, Roman theology, and that is kind of where the reader wants to begin the process of trying to figure out what the heck is going on here.
I'm sorry, allow me to interrupt,
Oh
please.
yeah, please do. Yeah.
Do you also believe that Paulina is an oblique reference to Paul? And if so, might this also be an oblique reference to the mouse god, Apollo?
Sure. But I think just as, the first level of sort of interpretation, to get into like Apollo symbolism, it would be after the fact, after you'd actually solved the puzzle, then you could sit back and try to figure out, well, what exactly, in the Roman thought world is being expressed here. But Paulina is shown to have parallels with the character who is just an absolute spot on parallel to the disciple Paul in the New Testament. So that character's name is not given, but when you just take the masculinization of Paulina, you have Paul, and so there would be, you know, just one of the sort of many ways that this little literary puzzle sort of identifies the characters in Christianity, but also explains how they were created and for what purpose. It's actually quite an ingenious literary construction, and it's a shame that you know, scholarship hasn't spent more time trying to work through the parallels that the three stories have, because I think that the explanation I give, or you know, the solution to the puzzle is pretty straightforward. I don't think once you understand the three stories are in fact created in relationship to one another and they create a puzzle you're supposed to solve. I think if you get to that point, the actual solution is pretty trivial to achieve. You end up with a story of what the Romans did and why they did it in terms of the creation of Christianity.
Well, we have the Christ myth in the background of this, which is a myth of self-sacrifice anyway. So that would
exactly, and that's why I would. That's the main reason why I go to some length to explain the Decius Mus pun that I assert is in, you know, is being referenced with the character Decius Mundus, because it is a sort of parallel to the sacrifice that Jesus makes, where he dies for your sins. In the case of Decius Mus, he sacrifices himself for the good of the Roman army. The good of.
Are you implying that Jesus then is something of a secret agent for the Romans, at least from a propaganda standpoint?
Well, of course, yeah. I mean, that would be exactly what I would.
And scholars are kind of failing to apply an intertextual analysis of this.
That's right. Well, they are absolutely failing to attempt to apply intertextual analysis to these three stories, which, you know, people will make the claim that the testimonium is an interpolation, that it has been inserted into the text. This is just very common position in New Testament scholarship.
Right, and in fact, they say it interrupts the flow. That
because it doesn't really work into the description of Pilate's military campaigns that Josephus is recording. It's very awkward, and it just has the feeling of being inserted artificially. But the problem with that understanding is that you also have to then explain why the other two stories were inserted at this point. You see what I mean? You can't simply say, well, okay, this is an artificial insertion for all of these reasons, particularly the fact it breaks the flow, and then maintain that these next two stories are different in some way, because they are obviously fictional. They are ludicrous fantasies. And so you need to have some explanation. If you're going to use the insertion explanation for the testimonium, the story about Jesus, then you have to also have some explanation for the next two stories. And if they were all inserted at one time, which, because they've inserted at exactly the same point, and they have so many parallels to one another, at this point it becomes almost, you know, self-evident that they form a kind of a puzzle. That there is some, in other words, my point is that there is some relationship that they have, which is not absolutely clear in just the reading of the overt text. So in other words, the reader seemingly needs to do some calculation to be able to have an explanation for the parallels and for why these three stories were inserted there. And my explanation is, in terms of explanatory power, is strong because it explains everything, every line. It all makes perfect sense once you just look at the three stories as a literary puzzle. And the particular kind of puzzle, which I'll just describe, is that the stories tell different aspects of the creation of Christianity by the Flavian Caesars. But to create the story of that historical event, you need to switch the names of the different characters in the three stories. And this then creates a new story or a different story where it's the same sort of plot line of the Odysseus Mundus story, but you've switched out the names of some characters so that you can identify Paul, you can identify Jesus Christ, you can identify, you can identify Caesar as Jesus, and then suddenly you see that the fooling of the Jewish woman in Odysseus Mundus by wicked priests is actually, helping you understand what the Flavian Caesars did, their process in order to create Christianity.
And there's a theme of adultery there, is there not? Perhaps you could
Yeah, what they do is they take the idea of a religious Jewish woman who is actually that it would be in the third story. She is a religious Jewish woman, and she's deceived by priest. Um, and then her husband is named Saturnius, and he goes to Tiberias, and the Jews are punished for having done this. But in the central story, the longest story, the Odysseus Mundus story, you have a woman of dignity who is also fooled by priests. Her husband also knows Saturnius the emperor. He goes to the emperor, and the emperor then punishes people for having, done this transgression.
Really hold up historically, does it?
No, it's the stories are not historical. They're not even close. I mean, there's actually assertions which are obviously wrong. In other words, in one of them, in the middle story, the Odysseus Mundus story, they talk about the destruction of the temple, and that this would have been the temple of Isis, because the religion in the middle story is the religion of Isis.
Right.
And this is then swapped out for the parallel religion in the third story, and then the religion becomes Judaism. And at that point, once that transition is made, you're really getting very, very close to the actual historical reality. And it almost becomes very, very clear. Because in the first story, the testimonium, you have Jesus being described as coming on the third day. And this is basically a declaration of divinity, right? I mean, it's,
right.
And now in the middle story, you also have someone coming on the third day, and that exact expression is used. He comes on the third day, but he doesn't say he has already fooled the woman into believing he's God. Now he comes on the third day, and he says, guess what? I'm not a god. So it's like you have the third day divinity declarations. One is negative and one is positive, but they are, when you have all of these different parallels, the author is challenging the reader to try to see these parallels and to show or to understand how they could be connected, how they could be related. And the third day divinity declarations in the first and second story, you just are to be switched, so that now you've got basically the story of Jesus as someone who is used to fool the Jews. And on the third day, the truth is, the real fact is that the idea of coming back to life is, not something that's real. And this is the Roman kind of way of like letting history know what they did, how they fooled the Jews with this third day divinity declaration.
Right. Now, we also might recall that there's a military theme here, and that the Jewish scriptures are often using adultery as a kind of worshiping other gods.
Yeah, that's right. And now, but that I don't go into that in my description. You always have this tendency to elevate my analysis, but you're absolutely right. That certainly is what I would regard as one of the. It comes from the story comes from the Roman thought world. Obviously, these are Roman patrician class educated individuals. They have a certain sense of humor, certain way of looking at the world and literature that they share. And those kind of shared, cultural, literary elements pop up in these stories. They're actually making, in fact, references to them. But when I bring out the analysis, like when I brought out the analysis in Caesar's Messiah, which is the basic typology in the Matthew, Mark, and Luke, to the history that Josephus wrote of Titus's military campaign. I don't really go into that higher level. That higher level is I think more interesting in many ways, and I think in the future there will be an area of a lot of analysis. You're certainly showing kind of the direction that scholarship should head, but I don't go into that because I deliberately, even though I could see quite a bit of these things, I didn't want to put anything out that would be kind of too far in the building block approach. My point is that when you do that, you end up with very kind of connections and assertions, sort of interpretations, which are built upon prior understandings and are therefore more difficult to defend, because you have to go through the whole process to get to the point where you can make a connection like that. The Gospels are very much and the New Testament is very much a building block construction, where once you've solved sort of the more primitive or simpler aspect of the typology, other things become available to understand.
Even Apuleius, because the golden ass is an Isis cult parody.
Well, yeah. Also, I mean, for just an example, in this story, you have the fact that the priest puts on the mask of Anubis to fool the woman so that he can have sex with her, right? Now, this is obviously a tip of the hat to Domitian, because when you had the civil war that the Flavians waged in Rome in order to depose the Julio-Claudians, Domitian was the only Flavian family member inside Rome, and so he was in great danger. And in order to escape, he put on the mask of Anubis. So the story is, I would point out, is actually being written during probably the reign of Domitian. It would have been after Titus's death. That's when they would have created Antiquities. And so the person who's creating these three stories and creating the puzzle is making an homage to Domitian as basically the Caesar now, who is the one who fooled the Jews into worshiping him. And the introduction into the way to understand this is the fact that you've already solved the Gospels. The author of the Testimonium and the two stories that it's related to is writing for readers who have already solved the Titus typology. You see what I mean? He knows that the reader has gotten that far and now knows to look for intertextual relationships and puzzles, and knows how to go about beginning the process of solving for them. So that is a building block which is necessary to actually understand the little three-story puzzle that and it's not Josephus, that's just a nom de plume that is being used to create the idea that there's a historian, in back of all of this text, that we have as the histories of Josephus. But it is, what you're really seeing is intellectuals and the court of Domitian. Titus is dead. The Gospels have already been written. The Son of Man, the name is that Jesus is describing is solved by the understanding of the intertextual typology. In other words, a reader who knows how the typology is operating can easily look and at the passage where Jesus is predicting the Son of Man is going to be coming, and know that the only individual that this could be, and in fact is being asserted by the typology, is Titus Flavius. So the names have been switched. This is my point. You have Titus Flavius and you have the Son of Man. Well, they're the same person. There's just different names to describe this individual. Now, when you get to the Testimonium and the two stories that follow it, you have the command to do not, well, not command, but the instruction that you should not value the business of names, right? Now, this is written for, that line is written for people who've already solved the Titus Jesus typology. They know what the author is telling them, that the business of names is just something that the Caesars use to fool people with, right?
Right. Well, this is what the mystery cults are doing. They're hiding their message by interspersing it between text.
Yeah, that's right. And it's not the kind of this kind of literary puzzle is not, that unusual. You're just asking the reader to see an obvious story that these parallels create that is not written. It's something that the reader has to, have cognition to be able to grasp.
And the historians hate this because,
well, it turns Josephus into a literary intertextual puzzle, and they want to keep the Josephus as historical text, because, and here I think we've touched on this briefly, is that, look, once you've kind of broken into the typology, the stuff I show in Caesar's Messiah, the kind of the beginning level of this stuff, the history of the first century is gone. There isn't any history. There's nothing you can trust. You have propaganda, you have literary puzzles, and then you have vanity, legacy that is being presented as history. So you don't really have a good understanding of history any longer. The historians, I'm afraid, have to basically give up their PhD theses because the history is gone. What we have are fictional and theological fiction that is being used for propaganda.
Right, but what I keep getting is that the truth is hidden in plain sight. Yet, if you have the knowledge,
exactly,
the background myths,
exactly,
you can do it. And isn't this perhaps what the mystery cults taught people to do?
I would have to speculate, but I would say that this would be exactly what they would teach them to do. And I also think that, you have a kind of secret language. The oligarchs use historical text. And remember, the Gospels are presenting themselves as, even though they're kind of strange, as a historical text. They use historical text for propaganda, for political purpose. The idea that the Caesars would hire like Tacitus, Dio, or Suetonius, the court historians, and create a history because they wanted the people in posterity to have an understanding of what happened is just ridiculous. They simply don't operate like that. They use what purports to be history for propaganda, and they aggrandize themselves. There's vanity being appeased, and then there's also just political construction. They're trying with the story of Jesus to make people obey. They're trying to make them feel that there's some higher power they need to, that for some reason has given the authorities their positions, and therefore you need to have this religious reason to not rebel. I mean, it's really that simple. It's just very simple propaganda for the purpose of social control. Religion was used by the ruling class as propaganda. I mean, from the very beginning, it's just that religion and propaganda for social control go hand in hand, and it goes all the way back to the beginning of language, basically. So this is just the condition that we have to deal with. And New Testament, the Christian theologists that try to tease out history from these stories in the New Testament, or New Testament historical scholars that are using Josephus as a platform of history, so you can understand Roman life during this time and understand maybe the relationship of the Gospels, to actual history. I mean, Philip, this is all, unfortunately, it's completely nonsense. It just is not real. You don't have the right interpretive framework. It's exactly the same thing as trying to understand, middle age social life by using Shakespeare's plays as historical text. I mean, these are fantasies for theatrical, for dramatic, and for propaganda purposes. So we've got to look at them that way. And when I wrote Caesar's Messiah, there really wasn't anyone looking at this literature in that way. It's just incredible. Probably the closest. Well, actually, that's not true. I mean, Cliff Carrington, who was the Australian autodidact, was certainly on this path. He hadn't published his work. I wasn't aware of, but he was actually following kind of the same path I was. He hadn't understood the overall typologic sequence, how everything is the sequence that goes through the Gospels. But he was coming up with, he was seeing a lot of the parallels. But other than Cliff, the closest would probably Robert Eisenman, who he had done all kinds of analysis in James, the brother of Jesus, and came up with the basic idea that there was a Roman hand. He could see, comparing the Dead Sea Scrolls to the Gospels, that someone had basically overwritten a lot of Jewish scripture to create a false religion, basically, that would fit, a false Judaism that would fit into the Roman Empire. So I think he was certainly onto the right track. He didn't follow the typologic path, but he was he was at least revolutionary in that regard. But beyond that, there wasn't anyone. People were still stuck in the, Josephus is a real historian. The Gospels were written by sincere people. They're written by, Matthew, Mark, and Luke were real individuals, and they were writing for different Christian sects. And so you can understand, I think, just, listening to what I've said, that when you have the wrong framework, when you have the wrong interpretive framework, you're not going to make any progress. You're just going to go in the wrong direction. And that's what Christian scholarship did. It ended up, at the point where it really couldn't see things as obvious as the connections between the testimonium and the two passages that follow it. And this, if you just read the three passages, if someone, listening to us has a copy of Josephus, just go to Antiquities, look at the testimonium, the Josephus is the story of Jesus, and then read the next two stories, and ask yourself, well, there's a lot of parallels between the three stories. They have a lot of strange relationships. Why is that? And yet it wasn't even a question that New Testament scholarship was asking.
Right.
So there is the problem, is that they're doing a lot of energetic analysis, but it's just using the wrong framework. So all it does is takes them in the wrong direction, where they actually cannot even see after a certain point what is right on the page in front of them.
Right. And yet that's just the cults covering their own teachings. And it seems to me that the Christians are intentionally making people look to other religions and look outside one specific religion to a more general paganistic view.
Of course, yeah. I mean, it's, the Christianity, when it was created, was really just a clever way of putting Judaism into the imperial cult religions. I mean, that's hard to believe, but that's really what it is. In other words, when you get to Jesus's prediction about the Son of Man coming, right? And that he's talking about Titus Flavius, right? Once you get to that point where he's talking about the Roman Caesar coming, and this is a divine person. I mean, Philip, you are now literally into the theological world of the imperial cult. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So it is literally a way, the literature is a way to make sure that the power of paganism doesn't stop. And it's a way to transform Judaism, which is monotheistic, or sort of, into one of the religions that fits into the empire and can get involved with imperial cult worship. Even though to do it, they have to fool the Jews into thinking that the Son of Man is a Jewish, individual. They have to see Jesus as a real prophet and all of the other aspects of Christianity. But at the end of it, at the core, is just that that desire to keep the imperial cult, basically the theological power of the Roman Empire.
Yeah, that's just fascinating stuff.
Yeah, well, that's what actually, that's what actually happened, and so this is why when you go into the puzzle of Decius Mundus, you really are basically fulfilling the criteria that you established, that you talked about there, because really what this is they're telling you how they are morphing Judaism into the imperial cult. That's really what you're getting there. It takes a while. You have to solve it and then think about what they really is the purpose of all this. But really, these are Caesars whose interest is vanity, and that means maintaining the imperial cult. This is imperial cult literature. It's created by people who are inside the imperial cult for the people who are worshipped by the imperial cult. So this is what you get when you create literature inside the imperial court. You get basically theology that fits into the imperial cult.
Right. Well, the scholars have seemed to try to focus too much on using a Jewish lens and looking at the world instead of looking at the world in a paganistic view from the people running a country that is running large parts of the world. So they have to do this.
I mean, that's the basic bamboozlement. And isn't it well stated? That's exactly what is going on. And gosh darn it, Philip, it's still going on as we sit here having our conversation.
Yes, I know. And I, for many years, I don't have a big book out like you. So when I talk to scholars, you wonder about how me getting talked over. This is what happens inevitably every time. They revert back to history. They know the history. They're going to look through a Jewish lens at this. It's going to be monotheistic. And I'm saying, wait a minute, the Romans don't really think that way. And if they wrote this, then you're taking the wrong approach. You're applying the wrong interpretive framework, as you say.
Exactly right. Couldn't be more spot on. And that is just the problem that is that all kind of really original scholarship into this area will be encountering and dealing with for the next 100 years, because the historical premise of the Jesus literature, whether or not it's a history or something that was created by followers of kind of a morphed mystery cult, or some other trajectory that the literature that is sincere, right? Some sincere trajectory that ends up with the Gospels. I mean, if you have that as your framework, you're just going to miss the whole thing, because this is very kind of, the literature is not coming from a sincere place. It is, and so you need to look at it and analyze it as just as it is, as literature. The idea that this could be related to history is not demonstrated. You don't need it to interpret the literature. You just need a clear mind. And as you say, if you move into the world of Roman paganism and start looking at the literature with that lens, which you certainly should do, because it's such an obvious, when you look at, for example, all of the technical terms of the imperial cult, these are very specific and strange religious terms which end up in literature, which is part of the imperial cult, Caesar worship. When you look at all of these words that show up in the Gospels and really nowhere else, right, in Greek literature, you have to wonder, well, wait a second, how do the authors of the New Testament know all of these fancy terms from the imperial cult? Where do they get them from? So the simple and clear-cut explanation is they're coming from the same source, which, as I point out, the only known group that could have produced the Gospels is the Flavian court. That's the only place where you had the political perspective and the technical ability. let alone the motivation, right? But when you look at capacity, opportunity, and motivation, where else does it exist other than the imperial cult and the Roman Flavian intellectual circle? That's the only place that is known to have had all the attributes that are needed to produce this literature. So why isn't this the number one candidate? Why is that? It's just because the Christian religion was so powerful, it dominated the minds of the people who are looking, at history and at religion, to the extent that they can't see any other alternative. It's just some people take it as honest, inspired religion, and others take it as the kind of inspired religion of people who are deluded into believing in Jesus. But everyone sees it as sincere literature, and so no one makes any progress in understanding it.
Right. Well, it seems to be mystery cults are very dialed in to a mythological level that has escaped the historical researchers.
Yeah, I mean, one thing about the mystery cult is that, which is a shame, of course, is that there's so little written material, which is why they're mystery. But you can kind of piece together their theology in different ways. And I certainly think that the mystery cults were connected to and often used by, I can't really prove this, but my conjecture would be that the imperial cult kind of swept them all up. And I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. When Vespasian became Caesar, he actually was, I think, in Alexandria when they had defeated the Julio-Claudians, so the road to the throne was open to him. He went into a religious temple of Seriphas in Alexandria, and when he emerged, he made the statement, "I have become Seriphas." He actually made this statement. In other words, it was part of his divinity that he had achieved by becoming Caesar. But moreover, the stories of that event maintain he performed 2 miracles. He cured a blind man with his spit, and he also, healed a withered arm. Classic miracles, and also appeared in the gospel, right?
Right.
So there you have the cult.
Those are the 2 root miracles.
Yeah, exactly. So there you have the cult of Seriphas basically being swept up into the imperial cult, because you got to remember the imperial cult, it has some standards. I mean, there were 5 Caesars at the time of Domitian, and only 5 that had been actually deified by the Roman Senate. And in order to get deified, you had to show that you were basically had these connection into divine stuff. So for Vespasian, these miracles that he performed as Seriphas would have been basically given, I'm sure, to the Roman Senate as examples of his divinity. And so you can see now that the mystery cult of Seriphas and the imperial cult that now has these Seriphas done miracles, they've kind of morphed. You see what I mean? It's really the Caesars, I think, were very pragmatic when it came to religion. They would just take up everything that they could that would have been useful for social control. So paganism was a kind of religious propaganda that they would put into, whenever it would be necessary, useful, and it would be inside the imperial cult. But I don't think they, at least not at the time of the Flavians, they wouldn't have tried to get rid of all of the other pagan religions. They would have just, as Vespasian did with Seriphas, they would have used it when it was useful.
Right. Well, let's get back to the fact that Paulina is a pun on Paul. Now let's take Paulus as a pun on the polus. And so this is the people in general, the people of the city. And in Rome, they're from everywhere. They're from all over the world. Okay. So those people are left in the dark. These are the people that killed Jesus in Jerusalem. It is the mob. It is the city that is slaying him. And so Paulina is deceived. She's the one who is deceived in this, just
Yeah.
like the general masses are deceived about the secret teachings of the mystery cult.
Yeah, a stand-in for Polus. So the three stories, the Testimonium and the Fulvia and then Ducius Mundus story, are all about Roman deception, the Caesar's deception of the population. That's really what they're describing, and so you have here you have the veil lifted, so that you can, if you use I think, come to the sort of correct understanding of the meaning of the three stories, you can see that the Caesars, in fact, are not confused by religion. They're very cynical. They see it as something that they use as a tool. They are not affected by it. So the imperial cult is basically insincere. It's just a kind of propaganda. It's all about the deception of the population. And if you step back and you go, well, what are they actually doing? They're deceiving for the purpose of social control. And by social control, I mean their domination of their subjects. So this is really what, very evil, um, and they're bragging about it, that they're able to deceive the polis, the people, and they're doing so because they enjoy the power. So this is, a sad thought, because now when you then have Christianity become the state religion, at this point it's self-evident, right, that this is being done for social control. This is not a sincere religion. It is a form of deception. It is just to create a political structure that ossifies the people who are controlling the world at the time they invented their fictional Judaism.
Right. And it would seem that the Orthodox Jews would frown on anybody studying the Isis myths and this sort of thing. So they're trying to appeal to the liberal Jewish people, it would seem like, or the educated Jewish people.
I think that what is a Jew is at this point in time, it's very complicated. You have different sects, some of which seem to be quite able to coexist with the Roman Empire. I mean, for example, look at the family of the Alexanders. Philo is, regarded as the most preeminent Jewish intellectual of the era, but his family is on the payroll to Rome. His family was the first family to stand for Vespasian becoming Caesar, and Tiberius, who wrote the proclamation, he identified Vespasian as a divine person, right? This is not normal, Old Testament Judaism theology. This is a kind of, blended theology that has more kind of, it's more just the Jewishness of the Alexanders doesn't interfere with their ability to make money in any way. So they don't take the theology seriously. However, the theology of the Dead Sea Scrolls seems to be very serious, that they're very intent on monotheism and are, basically self-flagellating themselves if they don't adhere to its strict standards. So you have a variety of Judaism, right? And it's really hard, you have to, well, it's not that hard, but you have to sort of know which form of Judaism is producing the literature, right? I mean, Josephus is supposedly, a Jew, and yet he's saying that the messianic prophecies foresaw Vespasian. Well,
Right.
this is not, a normal form of Judaism. But I also think that there was a group of Jews, certainly, that were quislings, that could get along with Rome and would compromise in order to maintain, their social status. I mean, the family of Herod maintained a Sanhedrin. Well, that certainly would have been a Roman promoting Jewish religious group. And so how would that have fit into the kind of, passionate folkloric monotheism that you see in the Dead Sea Scrolls. They wouldn't have gotten along, right? So,
Dead Sea community seems to me to only really be able to function in isolation.
yeah, well, that's it almost by self-definition, because they were so strict in their standards for behavior, seemingly were so arcane, and that they couldn't have existed really that easily in the normal, kind of secular world. I mean, let's
In
just
fact, their community was sacred. The ground they were on was sacred.
I mean, and go back just a bit and look at the struggle that the Hasmoneans had, because this is really the beginning of what I think, ends up with Christianity on one side and Dead Sea Scrolls on the other. The Hasmoneans came into Judea and seized control because there was a Hellenization process, and the Jews of the region were being Hellenized, right? You had gymnasium, this kind of cult of athleticism and sexual behavior and stuff, but it was clearly not, the Hellenization wouldn't have fit in with sort of the stricter religious kind of standard that the Hasmoneans wanted to represent. They forcibly circumcised people who had Jewish backgrounds when they came in. And so the struggle between Hellenization and the Hellenized Jews and the Orthodox Jews was really the, kind of the cutting line that was, separated Judaism into two halves. And the secular Jews would certainly have been able to get along with the Herods, the Alexanders, and of course Rome. Whereas the ones that tipped in the direction of the fundamentalists, the Dead Sea Scroll community, they could not. So, when you consider the religion or the literature of the era, you've got to try to identify which side is it coming from, because otherwise you don't really, can't understand the author's perspective.
Right. Well, this is fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
I'm finding what you're saying very interesting, and I urge people to explore your book and to explore some of the background myths if you have time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it'd be interesting to have you put out a piece, kind of looking at the Decius Mus story from the perspective of Caesar's Messiah, and then trying to say, well, what was the thought world of the authors that created such a thing? Because you have the testimonium and and the different ways that scholars have parsed that thing, where they take out 5 words and they said there was these words should have been in there, they were deleted, and they just have such a strange way of dealing with it. Whereas really you want to take it all just as it is. You want to take all of the literature as it exists and see if you can make sense out of the text in that way. And if you do that, you can't make a lot of progress if you don't try to enter into the Roman pagan thought world. Then you'll see that the way I'm trying to suggest it can be understood makes perfect sense.
Right. Well, I think people should remember that Jupiter and Apollo turned against Troy. Okay, Apollo was the defending god of Troy when its king was Alexander of Walusa.
The thing that's
Josephus and Paul both changed sides as well.
Sure.
This is, again, it's kind of like Apuleius's golden ass. It's like that.
Well, it is. Yeah, of course. Good point. It's coming from that thought world. That is something that is influencing this whole structure of literature. So the odd thing is, the further you get away from the Roman thought world, the Roman pagan thought world, the harder it is to understand the Gospels. It's an odd thing, but I think that's true. I kind of got into the sort of understanding Roman paganism through my understanding of the Gospels, because you see what I mean? The logic, once you get it right, it runs backwards and forwards. You go from paganism into Christianity. You don't see the dividing line between the two that modern scholarship maintains.
Right. This is just fascinating, because this is what really goes to the core of the Christ myth. If you ask me, you can see Isis as something of a savior, of a Christ, if you want.
Of course, yeah. And in fact, in Caesar's Messiah, I go into the parallels between Isis and Jesus, and I'm basically just following the path you're suggesting. I'm just saying, look, here's the Roman thought world. Look at the way that they're, connecting. When they created Jesus, they were coming from this pagan perspective. It's not a Hebraic, ascetic kind of individual like in the desert. I mean, he's really more of a character that comes out of Roman paganism.
Great stuff.
Well, Philip, thank you so much. But I hope we can have another discussion next week.
Well, we can. In fact, I have people requesting me to continue with this series through a number of iterations.
I really enjoy the conversations, and I hope we can do one next week.
All right. Excellent. That's Joseph Atwill, Caesar's Messiah, here on Magic Jesus.
Thank you, Philip.
Please subscribe to Magic Jesus.